open. So I am going to bring us to this evening's presentation. We have The Inferno, the Great Boston Fire of 1872 with Anthony Sammarco. So Anthony, you've been with us a few times.
Yes.
Our audience absolutely loves you. We're so excited to have you back. It's unfortunate that we can't have, your books to have people purchase this evening, but I'm sure that if you can put that in the chat at some point, if people want to,
of course,
reach out and purchase your books, that would be wonderful. So I'm going to stop sharing and I'm going to allow you to use our screen and on with the show. So thank you.
Thank you. I want to welcome everyone and thank you so much for tuning in on a Tuesday night. It's a little bit cold. I'm at our summer house in Austerville. It's about 30 degrees and thankfully no snow. But this is a book that is my 85th book. I'm very proud of it. It's actually Inferno, the Great Boston Fire of 1872. This actually occurred on November 9th of 1872 and would destroy 65 acres of downtown Boston. It was the area of Washington Street between what is now Milk Street and Summer Street, all the way to the waterfront. And in that period, it wasn't just to destroy residences, places of worship, but also the mercantile buildings that had been built after the Civil War. So seen here on the cover, which is a detail of a Currier and Ives print of the fire that was done in 1873, we see the dome of the Massachusetts State House surrounded by church spires. Not only the fire raging in the downtown area of Boston, but we also see ferry boats, paddle boats, and even rowboats in the foreground. Because by midnight, Bostonians were chartering these boats so they could watch the fire destroy Boston. And in that instance, it's something that we realized was something that was 150 years ago, but was a great part of the history and development of Boston. Okay, so Boston, and this lecture is divided into three distinct areas: before the fire, during the fire, and after the fire. But Boston, as we see here, was called the Old South End, and it was considered the epitome of urbane living in the early 19th century. Charles Bulfinch had introduced neoclassicism in the 1790s with the design of the Tontine Crescent on Franklin Place. In fact, Samuel Adams Drake, author of Old Landmarks and Historic Personages of Boston, said, "Summer Street was, beyond dispute, the most beautiful avenue in Boston, shaded by a grove in a light, softened by the leafy screen and over the shadows of the big elms lying across the pavement. Seen in the center was a Bulfinch-designed church known as the Octagonal Church. Bedford Street was on the left, Summer Street was on the right, and it was a residential neighborhood." Throughout the period of the 18th and early 19th century, this was the epitome of what was truly the Athens of America. And seen here, with a portion of the Octagonal Church on the right, the residential quality of the neighborhood around Summer Street is evident by this photograph of the early 1860s, with a corner of the portico of the Octagonal Church on the right and row houses on the left along Bedford Street leading to Chauncey Street. The wide expanse of the open square in the foreground, paved in cobblestones, created an oppressive approach to the church and has long been known as Church Green. Well, during that period, many houses were being built that emulated the buildings on Beacon Hill and Bay Village. And since the mid-18th century, Summer Street has been one of the more fashionable residential areas in Boston. This was a duplex Greek Revival red brick row house that was designed by Asher Benjamin for Richard Tucker and James Page. It was the height of sophistication. And when this was completed, roughly in 1834, it only survived until 1865, when the area had become completely commercial. So in that instance, in the mid-19th century, Boston was undergoing major changes through the topographical infilling of the new South End, what is today the present South End of Boston, on either side of the neck of Boston, the massive infilling of the Back Bay marshes, as well as the increase in population by matriculation and immigration. And following the Civil War, Boston was to see its population increase to 250,000 people by 1870, of which one half was either immigrants or the children of immigrants. The city was embracing change, ethnic as well as religious, and was a far cry from the homogeneous town settled by the Puritans from England in 1630. But by 1872, much of the former residential neighborhood known as the Old South End had given way to commerce. Summer, Bedford, Kingston, Arch, Franklin, and Federal Streets, and others, had once been the pride of the Athens of America. But by the 1860s, most of the residents had moved to the newly filled South End, the Back Bay, and the suburbs. And the area was rebuilt with impressive five-story commercial blocks that not only changed the face of Boston, but were architecturally impressive with their splendid fronts that became the pride of Victorian Boston, its merchants, and the Bostonians who now throng the area. And Franklin Street in Boston, seen here, was originally laid out in the 1790s by Charles Bulfinch and included row houses on both sides of an elliptical curve. And known as the Tontine Crescent, this was an upscale neighborhood in the first half of the 19th century. But by the 1850s, the arc of Bulfinch's Tontine Crescent was maintained with the rebuilding of new commercial blocks in 1859. Seen here looking towards Federal Street with Arch Street on the right, the 4- and 5-story buildings commanded the streetscape and were the pride and joy of the city. But the new buildings would include the Cathedral Building. And this was designed by Joseph Billings and built on the site of the Cathedral of the Holy Cross, a Roman Catholic church designed by Charles Bulfinch and built in 1803 at Franklin and Devonshire Streets. It was established by Jean Lefebvre de Chevreuse, first Catholic bishop of Boston. And when Pope Pius VII created the Diocese of Boston, the church was elevated to a cathedral. The last mass was in 1860 and the church was demolished in 1862. Patrick Donahue bought the land and had this impressive cathedral building built where the Boston Pilot, of which he was the owner, was printed. There was also the Beebe Block. That was an impressive 5-story commercial block with a mansard roof that was built at Devonshire and Otis Streets at Winthrop Square. Built in 1861, the block was named for owner James Madison Beebe, a successful dry goods merchant, and the store carried on an enormous trade in dry goods with all parts of the country and was the largest jobber of dry goods in New England. This was what basically had become the city. But in the fall of 1872, though the city was growing by leaps and bounds, and of course population was increasing, in October and November, there was an epizootic in Boston. And in the fall of 1872, Boston was in the throes of an equine influenza that affected horses, most of whom began to show symptoms such as a cough and general sluggishness. The disease was said to have emanated from Canada, and within weeks, the symptoms had become prevalent in major cities. Horses showed a series of common symptoms, including discharge from the nostrils and eyes, a rasping cough, general exhaustion, and an inability to work. These symptoms and the images of sick horses were so ubiquitous that they became the subject of satire, as in an etching of an ill horse called a chivalrous patient, which appeared in Harper's Weekly. However, this was a serious situation as the impact on Boston by the affected horses was devastating, especially as horses were vital in not just pulling carriages and carts, but also in the delivery of goods, foods, and supplies. And the result was that manpower was necessary, and it extended to the transportation of fire engines, if needed at a fire. And with most of the horses in Boston suffering with equine flu, the Detroit Free Press said on October 26th of 1872 that horses worsened with a dry and hacking cough, moving with reluctance and general dullness, nasal membranes at first pale, watery discharge from one or both nostrils, ears and legs cold. And seen here, a family said to be in ruin because the family horse, which was a major means of transportation, as well as pulling a cart to market, was something that was undergoing, and you see here, the equine flu. 13% of the horses in Boston would die, But the idea was that though streetcars traversed the city and connected it from various points, they were all pulled by horses. Well, the Epizootic in the fall of 1872, affected in some ways by the horses, was devastating, especially as horses were important in not just pulling carriages and pushcarts, but also streetcars that crisscrossed the city of Boston. Seen here is streetcar 86 that connected Boston via the South End to Roxbury, terminating at the Norfolk House on Roxbury Meeting House Hill. And with most of the horses in Boston suffering from the equine flu, conductors and passengers are depicted in this etching pulling a streetcar along its tracks during the Epizootic. Even this horse, the chivalrous patient, was an etching that appeared in Harper's Weekly on November 16th of 1872 and depicts a horse suffering from the Epizootic with his hooves in a warm pail of water, a blanket around his shoulders, and a streaming hot toddy and medicine beside him. But this was really a very serious situation. And we realized in some ways that Boston, in the throes of an equine influenza, was something that was a major city that was shutting down. Well, seen here, this is a detail of a much larger photograph that's called Boston as the Eagle and the Wild Goose See It, is a detail of a photograph taken by James Wallace Black in 1860 from Samuel King's hot air balloon called the Queen of the Air. In 1863, Oliver Wendell Holmes wrote in the Atlantic Monthly, Boston, as the eagle and wild goose see it, is a very different object from the same place, as the solid citizen looks up at its eaves and chimneys. And if you look at this photograph, midpoint on the left-hand side, you see the spire of the Old South Meeting House. Follow it down 45 degrees, and you see the crenellated tower of Trinity Church, what was once the site of Filene's department store, and the area all in the back is what was destroyed in the fire. Well, the Great Boston Fire began in this building. It was owned by a man named Seaman Cluse. He was actually a German immigrant who had done extremely well in the 1860s and 1870s by not only purchasing property, but building new structures. This was a 4-story building with a mansard roof that he constructed at the corner of Summer and Bedford Streets. And this was something that not only had different shops on the ground floor and above, but one was a hoop skirt factory. And the story went that as the area was a commercial one, by Saturday afternoon of November 9th, things were slowing down, and by 6 o'clock, the entire area was deserted. There was no housing, there was no entertainment, and there were no bars in the area. So, of course, it was said that a spark was ignited from a fireplace that actually caused the building to begin engulfed in flames. And because the building had a mansard roof that was built of wood trussing, the building saw the flames continuing up the elevator shaft and burning the fire. Now, the problem was there was an Epizootic, so fire engines could actually not be pulled as quickly as they might have been with horses. And of course, it took well over an hour for a fire engine to arrive. The problem also was that there was also the fact of fire hydrants. And whereas there was enough pressure for a 3-story residential structure, there was not enough water pressure for a 5-story building. So not only did the fire have a head start, the lack of water and the lack of horses meant that Boston was actually beginning to burn. And it was burning by the lurid light of a burning cauldron. The fire had begun in the Cluse building on Summer Street, which was engulfed in flames within minutes. The fury of the fire rose to the wood frame mansard roof that burnt out of the reach of fire hoses and continued unabated until the flames inevitably spread from one mansard roof to the next. The heat from the burning buildings, the geysers of sparks and embers, became infernal, and its intensity caused the granite facades to implode, falling to the street. And it was said that blocks of granite weighing tons were split as if by powder and hurled across wide streets. The fire spread, and Russell Conwell, who wrote a history, remembered, in a falling building on Franklin Street, there were seen through the flashes of fire the forms of men attempting to leap from the windows. but they never reached the pavement. Their cries were heard above the crashing timbers and the noise of explosions, awakening shrilly echoes in the ears of those who heard, which will never cease to call. At the time of the fire, the face of the granite was peeled off like a chestnut in a toaster, and great granite chips tumbled to the ground as if an invisible hand with a mallet and steel was at work, bent on defacing the smooth surface at sharp lines with all the haste possible. Facades on the commercial blocks fell with a sudden roar, sending up showers of sparks and cinders, as well as a lurid black smoke that enveloped the streets. However, it was not just commercial blocks that were aflame, even churches were engulfed by fire. John Damrell is seen here with his initials on his belt buckle, holding his leather helmet with its chief badge and his brass speaking trumpet under his arm. He was the chief of the fire department, and Damrell was elected to the position of chief engineer of the Boston Fire Department in 1866. He warned city officials about the danger of fire in the business district, and he is concerned with the water power, shortage of fire hydrants, lack of fire equipment, and the density of tall buildings with wooden mansard roofs in the district. And recognizing the need for long-term improvements in construction practices, he also advocated for the establishment of a building department and building inspection services with the authority to enforce fire and building codes. He foresaw this, and of course, a year previous, Chicago had been destroyed by the Great Chicago Fire of 1871. And though this was not a Currier and Ives print of the Boston fire, it shows a fireman, and he's pulling the fire engine. And in this instance, you can imagine not only the professional firefighters, but the volunteer corps running to the firehouse to pull the engine, which could weigh 2 tons. And anywhere from 8 to 10 blocks before they arrived at the scene of the fire, undoubtedly the firefighters were winded, and when they got there, they couldn't actually have enough water to fight the fire. In some ways, buildings would actually begin to burn, and within an hour, they were destroyed. This is the cathedral building that you saw previously. Patrick Donahue, who was an Irish immigrant who had done extremely well and had bought the Pilot, the Roman Catholic newspaper of the Archdiocese of Boston, built this and called it the Cathedral Building because it was built on the site of the Cathedral of the Holy Cross. Because it was filled with type and wood, as well as all sorts of different chemicals, the building was destroyed within 45 minutes. And it was said to have been built at a cost of $300,000, a tremendous sum at that time, and was totally uninsured. Buildings themselves would be fought by the firefighters. And seen here, which was called Into the Jaws of Death, firefighters would actually squirt their fire hoses. They didn't reach above the 3rd story, and whereas fire practices meant that you would shoot the water at the roof to allow the water to fall down into the fire, in this instance, they were hampered on every turn they took. Boston, it seemed, was engulfed in flames. And this painting is called The Boston Fire, a view of Boston from across the harbor in East Boston, and it was painted by William Shaw in 1876. John Damrell, the city's fire engineer, described the fire saying, "The conflict raged for 15 hours with an unrelenting fury, and it was the most terrific engagement by the fire department for superiority over the fire fiend ever recorded in the annals of the city." It seemed that Boston was engulfed, whether it was depicted in a painting as we just saw, or here in a print by Currier and Ives. It just showed the magnitude in these 150-year-old depictions of what the fire was doing. Boston seemed to actually be spreading in some ways through the fire, and it would actually be in some ways that many people said that the fire had flown away as an eagle towards heaven. The fire burnt throughout the night, creating a macabre scene that could only be likened to that of Dante Alighieri's Inferno. Overworked firemen, frantic merchants, and curious onlookers made the scene one of utter chaos. And the fire was so intense that men could see the light flaming against the midnight sky, growing wider, broader, and higher. its flames so high that it becomes a beacon light to mariners 300 miles away, so bright that it gilds not only the dome of the State House and surrounding spires, but lights up the blue hills of Milton. The epicenter of the conflagration was engulfed in flames, and Frothingham, who also wrote a book on the fire, said that blocks of granite weighing tons were split as if by powder and hurled across wide streets, and planks went flying through the air as if they were feathers. People screaming, firemen yelling orders, with no one paying any heed, and the crash of falling blocks of granite, the hum of engines, the roar of the seething flames, the hiss of steam as immense volumes of water were poured in upon the burning mass, and the shouting of the firemen made a babel of horrible sounds. It was like a pandemonium. And in that instance, the city of Boston couldn't basically fight the fire on its own. And by 10 p.m., they began telegraphing to every city and town within driving distance to actually send fire engines and firemen. They came from as far as New Hampshire, Maine, and even Rhode Island. And seen here, which is a print that's a supplement to Frank Leslie's illustrated newspaper, an etching by J.B. Henderson shows the arrival of a special train from Worcester, conveying the Worcester Fire Department with steam fire engines to the scene of the disaster. The frantic and highly charged scene as a fire engine is removed from the flatbed of the train can be sensed as it was eased onto a ramp and then pulled by hand to the fire as hundreds watched from the sidelines. It seemed in some ways that the entire city was engulfed in chaos. And here in a detail of Russell's map of Boston, in the very center, we see almost the pie-shaped area of Washington Street at the top, Summer Street on the left, and Milk Street on the right, along with the waterfront. 65 acres was engulfed. And seen here from the roof of C.F. Hovey Company on Summer Street, this photograph looks across what had once been Franklin and Milk Streets after the Great Boston Fire of 1872. Russell Conwell said that the vista from the vicinity of Summer Street was grandiose and disheartening. Flames flickered up from time to time from the mass of broken, seared, disjointed masonry, played around the cracked and dismantled bases of the great carved iron pillars, and sometimes burst out vehemently from the interstices of the debris. And great columns of smoke rose majestically into the clear air and then formed into party-colored clouds which cast dull shadows over the scene. You can imagine what the idea of this photograph conveys, one of utter devastation. But they were also recorded by painters, and The Ruins of Boston was painted by John Enneking, and it is a striking scene in its graphic realism of the devastating fire. It was almost as if a thick, blood-red cloud was hovering over the city, as the Boston Globe article from November 11, 1872 said, filling the hearts of all with an ominous and indefinable mixture of terror and sadness. Lucius Beebe, the son of James Madison Beebe, said, Sunday morning dawned on a tremendous yellow pillar of smoke which rolled, like a symbol of doom, slowly over the harbor. And on the left is the spire of the Park Street Church with the dome of the State House. In some ways, seen here on Washington Street with the Old South Meeting House in the distance, these buildings look intact, but it was only the facades that remained. Everything beyond that was totally destroyed. In the foreground were pieces of granite that had simply imploded. They don't look very large, but these pieces were anywhere from 1,000 to 5,000 pounds each. In that instance, this was the new burnt district, and John Damrell, the city's fire engineer, was an integral witness to the destruction of the area of the fire and described its progress. The conflict raged for 15 hours with an unrelenting fury, and was the most terrific engagement by the fire department for Superior over the fire fiend ever recorded in the annals of the city. One can only imagine the confusion and anxiety of the firemen as fire chiefs shouted orders from their fire trumpets to men who could hardly hear above the roar of the fire and shouting spectators. Even if they could hear, the scene was one of such utter chaos that it only increased with time. A lack of water power from inadequate sources, and the fact that water could only reach to the third story of the five-story buildings daunted the efforts of the firemen, who watched and were unable to do anything to check the fire's spread. In addition, people were hindering the efforts of the firefighters, and something had to be done. Russell Conwell said that cordons of soldiery with fixed bayonets kept off the pressing crowd, or capturing a host of citizens between two lines reaching from curb to curb, marching them to the side streets, and gently expelled them from the vicinity of the crumbling and overhanging ruins. The roll of the drum was heard on every side, the sonorous fall in echoed, and those turbulently inclined among such of the spectators as not directly felt the sting of the loss by the congregation were speedily subdued by the militiamen, who seemed to bear a full sense of their importance. These were men who were called out by the governor. And seen here in this photograph, these were the Claflin Guards, Newton Company C, 1st Regiment, Massachusetts Militia. And they're drawn up in formation on Kilby Street, or what is now Post Office Square. Mayor William Gaston had requested, as Sunday drew to a smoking and hysterical close, that exhausted as they were, the police would not be sufficient to maintain order throughout the city. 6 battalions of the state militia were mobilized, and although martial law was never declared, so the thieves had no actual authority, the crowds naturally imagined that they had, and their presence was respected accordingly. Seen in the center is Captain William Barner Sears, on the left, Lieutenant Barnes, and on the right, 2nd Lieutenant Stearns, in front of the militia, drawn up in formation. The burnt district was cordoned off, and if one wished to pass, say if one was a merchant and wished to see his business, or what was once the business, they'd have to receive this pass. It actually says, "Pass the bearer within the lines enclosing the burnt district." And unless you had this, you could not enter. But it was something that many people wished to enter. But the members of the Sheridan's Rifle, seen here, were quartered at the Old South Meeting House, which was still an active place of worship at the time of the fire. A new church was to be built in Copley Square in 1876, and this would eventually become a historical museum as it is today. Here, soldiers posed for a photograph, some leaning on the high box pews, others standing on them, as they were on break from their guard duty. And the box pews, which once served as seats for worshippers, now served as hard beds for the soldiers, because they would live here for 6 months. In that instance, even the Boston Fire Department would turn out, along with, seen here, the Boston Police Department. And these men are actually photographed in front of the sub-treasury in United States Post Office that was under construction at Post Office Square. In the distance, this was a building built of Barry, Vermont granite, and in that instance, it stopped the fire. By banking the fire, by blowing up buildings before the fire reached, they were able to stem the spread of the fire. So in this instance, an area that is open today was once densely packed, and we realized in some ways that some of the devastation was not only picturesque, but was really quite interesting. Seen here, the area of Milk and Federal Streets were the ruins of Wright and Potter, the state printer. And the company was owned by Albert Wright and Robert Potter. And though the building was destroyed, the tall brick chimney marks the spot of the business, which has a sign stating that they have relocated to 34 School Street. Members of the Claflin Guard are seen on the right with rifles protecting the burnt district. And one wonders, why would they be there with rifles? Well, don't forget, these were places of business, 4 and 5 stories in a commercial building. Safes might fall all the way to the basement as the wooden floors burned. And it was said that close to 50% of the safes were actually fireproof. So it didn't really matter if you actually had accounts payable. It was the accounts receivable you wanted to save. Well, seen here, Russell Conwell said in his book, The History of the Great Fire in Boston, He described the burnt district: in the stead of noble buildings of granite and marble and brick were huge giant walls, torn and ragged, and broken columns of stone and iron. The lines of the street were entirely obliterated, and the ways were so blocked by great boulders of granite and heaps of debris, in some places from 3 to 10 feet deep, that those who had been the most familiar with this section before the fire were utterly unable to find their way, and groped about or clambered over the obstructing rock, brick, iron, and still hot rubbish, dazed and bewildered. In this instance, the days following the fire, canvas tents and temporary wood shelters with corrugated metal roofs were erected on cleared areas for those working in the burnt district to rest or have refreshment. This is Post Office Square, and here, seen in the shadow of the spire of the Old South Meeting House on Milk Street on the right, men are gathered around a liberty pole as they began the arduous task of rolling miles of canvas fire hoses and clearing away the debris which was dumped into Boston Harbor and along what became Atlantic Avenue. This was an active area, and in this photograph, which I found on eBay, it not only shows firemen, but men who ran the various shops, barber shops, chop shops, and even small sandwich counters. And this was an important way to realize that after the fire, the cleanup began almost immediately. And people began to look at the buildings in their picturesque state and realize in some ways what utter devastation there was. Not everything, as I mentioned, were commercial blocks. Trinity Church was located on what is today the site of the Filene's building. This was at the corner of Summer Street and Hawley Street. And Trinity, which was the oldest place of Episcopal worship in Boston, had this wonderful granite church with a Gothic tower. Seen here after the fire, it was something that they had already anticipated moving to the Back Bay, and they had already purchased land in Copley Square. But at that time, the Reverend Phillips Brooks had been rector of Trinity Church since 1869. And he said that the desolation of the fire is bewildering. Old Trinity seemed safe all night, but towards morning the fire swept into her, and there was no chance. She went at 4 a.m. I saw her well afire, inside and out, carried off some books and robes, and left her. She went majestically, and her great tower stands now as solid as ever, a most picturesque and stately ruin. She died in dignity. I did not know how much I liked the gloomy old thing until I saw her windows bursting and the flame running along her high old pews. But it wasn't just the church, it was also the crypts below the church. And commenting on the ruins of Trinity Church, Edmund Monroe Bacon said that its broken tower and partly crumbled walls presenting the most picturesque ruin of all in that costly conflagration. The interior of Trinity Church had been destroyed of everything except the stone walls, including the floor, exposing the family tombs in the crypt, and though the iron doors remained in place. Within just a few days after the fire, the city of Boston notified families to remove the remains from the crypts and rebury them in a cemetery, such as Mount Auburn, Forest Hills, Mount Hope, and even Cedar Grove Cemetery in Dorchester. The area, in some ways, seen here with Milk Street, which extends from Washington Street to Atlantic Avenue, lay in ruins from the rear of the Old South Meeting House to Oliver Street at Liberty Square. Soldiers stand among granite blocks of the ruins of a building, with many men gathered in the street on the right. Every bit of vantage ground, from the dread corner near which the fatal fire began to the waterside along State, was crowded with the motley groups of spectators, each asking 100 questions in as many breaths. Seen here, 2 merchants, one in a bowler, the other in a top hat, a policeman, and a man sitting on a board, are photographed amongst debris in the ruins of buildings on Arch Street. The tower of Trinity Church is seen in the distance and is enveloped in a haze, creating an almost ethereal scene to the burnt district. It was said, approaching the burnt district, one might readily have fancied himself in a recently captured and bombarded town during the Civil War. We also saw ladies, escorted by gentlemen, of course, who ventured into the midst of the burned district. They had been clambering all day over the ruins of their husbands' and fathers' warehouses, and listening with a sort of pride to their escorts describing the magnitude of their losses. It was something that attracted everyone, but it was said that the ruins were picturesque and fascinating. And the devastation of the burnt district was incomprehensible. Streets were covered in granite blocks and mounds of bricks from which iron pillars that had once supported the five-story commercial blocks lay bent and twisted. The area east of Washington Street was one large debris field that attracted the attention of Bostonians. And it was said on that Monday, November 11th of 1872, there were pictures of awful desolation and ruin in one great section, and immediately about and around, in marked contrast, pictures of a holiday or gala day kind, where strangers thronged unceasingly from morning till night, looking contented, interested, and happy, watching the cavalry as they cantered by, examining the wares of the itinerant peddlers on the Tremont Mall, studying the smoky sky through the big telescope, or trying the lung testers, carrying themselves for all the world as if it were a festival they had journeyed hither to see, rather than the destruction of a great section of a great city by fire. Well, this photograph says it all. Merchants, firemen, and even policemen stand amongst the ruins. And these picturesque photographs were done by upwards of a dozen different photographers throughout the city of Boston. And they chronicle in just a week's time what had been destroyed in less than 24 hours. People would comment on it, but it was something in some ways that affected almost every business. And this was the H&J Pfaff Brewery Company that was founded in 1857 by German immigrants Henry and Jacob Pfaff, and its beer was made from the good, crisp-tasting water of the Stony Brook in Roxbury to produce not just beer, but the lighter ale, a lager. With a large German population in Boston in the 1870s, Pfaff Brewery was extremely popular. And seen here, their office was on Arch Street, and possibly the brothers are seen in this photograph. It also shows that all things must come to an end. And after 18 hours of trial, Boston emerged from her baptism of fire. And in that space of time, it had destroyed hundreds of the costliest and most substantial warehouses in the country. This photograph shows the utter devastation wrought by the fire. Shells of buildings and walls pointing like fingers towards the heavens served as grim reminders of the once urban streetscapes of Boston. The granite blocks in the foreground would be used to the infill of Atlantic Avenue. And this, an archway of ruins, depicted what was once the Boston Button Company on Milk Street. It was sketched for Frank Leslie's illustrated newspaper, and it was said that the archway of ruins on Milk Street is an artistic feat of the fire fiend and presents the appearance of some classical ruin of ancient Rome or Greece, Babylon, Thebes, or Tyre. Well, in some ways, people would look at this and they said in some ways that these two men would stand on the rubble of Brewer and Tileston Company, which was owned by Thomas Mayo Brewer and John Boyes Tileston and located on Milk Street. Brewer and Tileston were the well-known printers and booksellers, and in the 1870s would annually print the Old Farmer's Almanac. The three granite piers are what remains of the building, with massive granite blocks strewn in the foreground. In some ways, even this building would show a guard protecting what is the tri-arched entrance to what was McCullough, Williams, and Parker Company on Washington Street, with a sign stating that the company moved to 15 Tremont Street. A well-known wholesale and retail dealer of ready-made and custom clothing, the store was one of the largest in the city, extending from Washington Street to Hawley Street. The facade was of white marble imported from Italy and remarkably survived the fire, though the five-story business was completely destroyed. and that facade was reincorporated into their new building, constructed in 1873. And seen here, a horse-drawn wagon is seen near Congress Street, and Lucius Beebe said that by the end of the week, the devastated section of the city showed signs of recovered order, and although smoke still curled from numerous cellars, and the protective agents were still engaged in tearing down tottering towers and chimneys, little shops, barber saloons, bars, and chop houses were springing into being under canvas tents or in hastily erected sheds and pine board shelters. In some ways, even a milk wagon from the Consumers Protection Association on Hanover Street in the North End delivered milk and dairy products to those who were working in the burnt district. There were hundreds of people working in the area, some living in wood shelters, and members of the militia quartered at the Old South Meeting House. This photograph is interesting as it shows the delivery wagon driver holding the reins with the policeman to the right, and the men on the left standing on the debris with Milk Street in the distance. Well, it was said that the site was a peculiar one, and the utter devastation of the burnt district in the days after the fire was beyond comprehension. Standing on Washington Street, one could see to the waterfront, with whole blocks leveled by the fire. Smoke still rose from cellar holes where wood and combustible materials lay and smolder, creating an eerie and unearthly light as the dawn broke. The history of the great conflagration says, huge fields of glowing ruins, covered with smoldering lambent fires, occasionally broken by piles of half-destroyed debris or standing walls, up which the blaze climbed and played, while overall hung a dense, murky pall of smoke, slowly floating to the southward in rolling, heavy, heaving billows borne by the gentle breeze. Well, seen here in a picturesque scenes of the incident, this was something that appeared in Harper's Weekly in December of 1872. It was done by Paul Frenenzi, a very well-known illustrator. I found this again on eBay, and it shows the highs and lows of the fire. And in these individual scenes, they depict fighting behind the barricades, outside aid coming, selling relics, Boston pluck, after the struggle, thieves and roughs arrested, and looking at the ruins. These were things that chronicled the fire. But in this photograph of Milk Street, which on the left-hand side is today the area of Post Office Square, shows buildings completely destroyed, whereas just in the distance, every building remained intact. It was something that nobody could understand, and in some ways, people tried to make sense of it. Seen here, a merchant, probably standing in front of the three-arched entrance of what was once his place of business, realizes in some ways that everything had been lost. These were streets that had been finally cleared of a little bit of debris, but look at the size of the granite blocks. This was something in some ways that many people realized, and this is Summer Street at Pearl Street, that there'd be anywhere from 3 feet to 10 feet deep of debris. The building in the distance was once an entire streetscape, but only this portion survives. This would eventually lead to the waterfront. But we'd even see that this was something that ministers began to actually preach in their sermons. And they would say that it was a visitation intended to shock the minds of our citizens. And the reaction by ministers to the devastation wrought by the Great Fire was swift and condemning, and was to be thought of as sermons for the next few months. Frothingham said that people, instead of attending divine services, thronged to the streets immediately about the fire, and churches were deserted. However, the following Sunday, ministers throughout Boston preached on the fire and its implications on life, greed, and loss. The Reverend Dr. Manning of the Old South Chapel preached, "The Lord gave, and the Lord hath taken away." The Reverend Dr. Webb of the Shawmut Congregational Church preached, "Shall there be evil in a city, and the Lord hath not done it?" And the Reverend John Beckley of the Somerset Street Baptist Church preached, "Every man's work shall be manifest when the day shall declare it, for it shall be revealed by fire." Well, However, it was the Reverend Cyrus Bartol of the West Church who preached the trial by fire, in which he delivered a sermon that was said to be a fine analysis of the influence of a great disaster upon the human mind, an acute essay on the harmony of nature above and beyond any local derangement of the elements, and was, withal, filled with sound, practical suggestions as to improved methods of city building, and a severe invective against the spirit of lawlessness now pervading the country. The congregation should be considered not merely as an accident which could be easily repaired, but as a visitation intended to shock the minds of our citizens into a due sense of the undue greed and haste which led to the building of mushroom blocks. Seen here, Thomas Nast, a wonderful political cartoonist of the 19th century, showed Liberty kneeling before the ruins of Boston as the fire fiend actually ascends into the heavens, along with her towering torch that would have destroyed the city. And here, Colonel Russell Conwell, who wrote a book called The History of the Great Fire of Boston, which recounted the impact of the fire in the city, and was written to place before the present generation, meaning 1873, a readable and trustworthy account of the Great Fire in Boston. Conwell had attended Yale and studied law at the Albany Law School, and was later ordained a Baptist minister. He is best remembered as the founder and first president of Temple University in Philadelphia. And today, Conwell's name lives on in the Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary. We realize that each of these people that I'll mention were part of this. And this is Harvey Washington Wiley, later known as the father of pure food at the turn of the 20th century. He was a volunteer firefighter at the Great Boston Fire, and he joined with others as they pulled a fire engine by hand from Cambridge across the West Boston Bridge spanning the Charles River. The engine to which he had been assigned, he said, was directly across from my rooming house on Church Street in Cambridge. He was a student at Harvard College at that time. In a short time, 100 students assembled at this machine, and we were told that the fire was in Boston, and we could see the glow without any difficulty. On either side, a long rope, we started for Boston. We urged our engine forward with all the power we had, fearing that the fire would be put out before we got there. And the supply of water was not very abundant in this locality because when it was changed from residence to business, the water service had not been enlarged. There was also Louisa May Alcott, who said that the fire was so great that it created a whirlwind and an awful roar. I saw blazing boards, great pieces of cloth and rolls of paper flying in all directions, falling on roofs and spreading the fire. The granite blocks on Franklin Street went down like card houses, and heavy cornices peeled off as of paper. Firemen could not go up their ladders, the heat was so intense, and many were killed by falling walls. The red glare, the strange roar, the flying people, all made the night terrible, and I kept thinking of the last days of Pompeii. And of course, the Reverend Cyrus Bartol, the minister of the West Church on Cambridge Street, at the time of the fire, he was a graduate from Bowdoin College and the Harvard Divinity School, and was not only to preach for 50 years, that was the dog, but was an author and would publish articles in various periodicals, including the Christian Examiner, the North American Review, and the Unitarian Review. In 1849, he published Hymns for the Sanctuary, also known as the West Boston Collection, and was well respected for his insightful writing. The New York Tribune referred to Bartol as probably the most successful minister in Boston, and his sermon, which was seen here, was preached on Sunday, November 17th of 1872, was called The Trial by Fire. His sermon was both powerful and thought-provoking, and a quote from the moving sermon is as follows: "For our calamity is our penalty, a fine we pay long ago, predicted by our inflammable architect, by prophets of the combustion, yet defied by greed of rapid gain, but coming to pass as naturally in the high tinder boxes ranged close together out of the reach of engines, as when you drill a hole and put in the charge and light the fuse or lay the train, the blast follows. Well, in some ways, this devastation was addressed immediately, not just by the mayor of Boston, but seen here, the governor, William Barrett Washburn, who was governor of Massachusetts in 1872. And after the fire, he was instrumental in urging the legislature to be called into special session to enable the provision of state assistance for the rebuilding of Boston. Measures passed, including a bill simplifying the establishment of the insurance companies, since several were bankrupted by the blaze, and a bill authorizing the city to issue bonds to speed the rebuilding effort, which would encompass 65 acres of Boston. But he also had a proclamation of public thanksgiving and praise. Well, this was actually to take place on November 27th of 1872 in reaction to the extreme severity of the fire in Boston. His proclamation declared a day of thanksgiving to God, the creator and preserver, for the favor shown unto us during the year, and that most of our industries have prospered, that our storehouses are filled with an abundant harvest, and that we have suffered so little from the great fire in our chief city. Of course, it was 65 acres. I think it was really more than just a little. There was also the fact that these paintings were done left and right. The Boston fire, though it says November 8th, it was actually November 9th, was painted by Fred Phelps, and it shows the fire spreading along the dock seen from East Boston across Boston Harbor. There's a ship in the harbor and small boats, but the fire illuminated the night sky and attracted large numbers of curious people who either gathered to watch the fire or from afar, but Bostonians viewed the blaze as an awesome spectacle. There was even sheet music that would actually be composed, and it was called Homeless Tonight or Boston in Ashes. And this was a song composed by Charles White and published by White, Smith, and Perry of Boston. The cover of the sheet music depicts two terrified young girls clinging to one another as they escape from the burning city, with the Tower of Trinity Church on Summer Street in flames behind them. One poignant stanza of the song was, "Who will pity us, and who will give us shelter through this sad and lonely night?" Well, the music was really quite popular. And seen here, though it was written by Charles Wright, who was a well-known songwriter of the period, the sheet music proved so popular that it ran through several editions and was a piece for piano that could be played at home and thereby rekindle memories of the fire. White's lyrics created a sentimental and heartfelt pity for the two young orphans depicted on the sheet music cover. And the stanza says, "Lone and weary through the streets we wander, but we have no place to lay our heads. Not a friend on earth is left to shelter us, but both our parents now are dead. Poor mother died when we were both young, yet father made for us a home. But now he's killed by falling timbers, and we are left here all alone." In some ways, it was like springing phoenix like from the ashes. And the devastation of the fire was tremendous and was a shock not just to Bostonians, but to the readers of national newspapers. The New York Tribune had reporters and correspondents sending information for the Daily News, as well as artists who sketched the ruins. The newspapers printed thousands of words of dispatches, including an hour-by-hour account of the progress of the blaze, a complete list of the destroyed properties, maps of the Boston business district, the assets and Boston liabilities of scores of insurance companies, stories on the local angle of the calamity, and other features, which many might have imagined the devising of only a recent high-pressure reporting. Day after day, new stories were printed, including that in the New York Times on November 13th of 1872, that boldly declared Boston alive again, and that businessmen too busy to mourn over their losses. Indeed, the regrouping and Yankee pluck was more than evident as businesses relocated and began anew. And seen here in 1873, Church Green on the left is the junction of Bedford and Summer Streets. once the site of the octagonal church, and was rebuilt after the fire with 5- and 6-story commercial buildings that created an impressive streetscape, along with interesting signage in the 1870s. In this vein, Reverend Bartol said, "Boston admires Boston. She is worthy the admiration she wins from those she bore not, in her borders or far away. She gets up quickly from her fall, rubs her robes, professes she is not hurt, makes nobly light of and laughs at her hoist to the ground. She says she is no beggar and wants to refuse the alms, like a prince she has bestowed. A grand temper not unbecoming, but to be prized as one of the pillars of virtue." George Clough was the man who oversaw the rebuilding of the burnt district. He was a well-known architect, and he was elected the first city architect of the city of Boston, serving from 1873 until 1878. Every building in the burnt district, every municipal building, every school, fire station, and police station was under his direction. And the city continued to grow by leaps and bounds. And seen here on Milk Street, looking towards Washington Street, these new buildings were completed by 1874 and are seen here in 1876 draped in bunting for the centennial of the United States. This actually had bunting, and in the very center was the building built on the site of Benjamin Franklin's birthplace, still called the Franklin Building, and these buildings survive. But you began to realize in some ways the building that had actually broken the fire and allowed it to, in some ways, to be ended before it reached was the post office and sub-treasury. This was designed by Alfred Mullett in association with Gridley Fox Bryant and Alexander Esty, and was in the process of being built when the fire destroyed the surrounding area. It was the most impressive building built during the Victorian period and was in the Renaissance style and built of granite. On the top of the twin towers flanking the center roof were two 17-foot-high white marble statues by Daniel Chester French. On the left was labor, supporting domestic life and sustaining the fine arts, and on the right, science, which was controlling the forces of the newfangled electricity and steam. And the central portion was ornamented with a heraldic figure, which was appropriately an eagle, with outspread wings grasping a shield with its talons. Seen here in a photograph of 1900, Boston had seen something that was not only destroyed by fire, but arose with alacrity. On the right-hand side, between the Old South Meeting House at Milk Street and Summer Street, new buildings actually showed how Boston had grown. And in this instance, with small shops, bowling alleys, pool rooms, but also, as you might see in the very center, Raymond's department store, the area became one wholly of commerce, of great department stores such as Jordan Marsh, Filene's, as well as a multitude of others. And that Boston, with its pluck, was simply rebuilt. Well, Inferno, the Great Boston Fire of 1872, was a joy to write. I enjoyed it tremendously, and it has many more images, many of them in photographic format that are in color. But in some ways, it chronicles something that many people have never even heard about. I teach at the Boston University Metropolitan College, and though I have many students that are of the traditional 18 to 22 age, because I teach in the evening, I have a multitude of people of all ages, many of whom don't live in Boston. And the whole idea is by teaching this, not only do we learn from our past, but we realize in some ways that the city has evolved in many different ways, and that this Great Boston Fire, 150 years ago, last fall, is something that changed and created a new city, something that probably many of us knew in the 20th century as the area of downtown Boston with the great department stores. Thank you very much. I hope you enjoyed it.
We do have one question.
Please.
How many deaths occurred, and how did Boston City Hospital contribute to the care of the injured?
Well, there were 21 people that were killed, all of whom were either professional firefighters or volunteer firefighters. And I actually dedicate the book to those 21 men. In that instance, there were no private citizens killed, which is unheard of with 65 acres. There were very few injuries, other than the people that actually had died. Some people actually had some burns. Boston City Hospital, of course, was featured in the 1860s as the great hospital of Boston's masses, but there was also the Massachusetts General Hospital, both of whom had people who had broken bones or had been injured or even had been singed in some ways by the fire itself. They were instrumental. But don't forget, this was 1872, before penicillin, before really anything that would actually be of a 20th century invention to stem pain as well as, of course, infection. But they were instrumental in helping people.
Thank you for that, Elizabeth. Were there any more questions?
I want to mention this is available on Amazon.com. It's something in some ways that I can't believe is even a feature on the MSN feed. I have MSN.com. I'm always very proud when I read the death notices in the morning and I see the Inferno book on the cover. It's something I thought in a lot of ways. I really enjoyed doing this, but it was also something in some ways that it's been well received. So I hope the lecture was informative, and I hope the illustrations began to explain in some ways the aspect of the fire.
It was excellent. Thank you so much for joining us once again for another wonderful session. I really learned a great deal and really appreciate it. And I believe other people did too. We have Diane saying fascinating history. Thank you so much. Yeah, 85 books. Yeah, that's impressive.
I'm working on a book on the Freedom Trail right now. So that'll be out, I hope, by the fall. So it's a new interpretation.
Andrew says, how do you approach writing them?
Well, you know, because I teach, in a way, I look at these books as somewhat ancillary. It's something that they're fun, but I also have to look at the photographs that are available. Not everybody has the photographs, but I buy anything I find on eBay. I usually go to paper shows, ephemera shows, but try to make something that's visually stimulating as well as, I hope, well written. You know, today we have a general public that, unlike us, 50 and above, that many people don't realize in some ways they're visually stimulated. It's television, videos, YouTube, but there's also the written word. And in some ways, these books are something in some ways that are beautifully illustrated, but they also have writing. And I think it's a very important feature, though this is being recorded, and I hope many people in Winchester will actually watch this. I probably know many of you. I lived on Bacon Street in my youth. But the idea here is that this is something in some ways that probably will be not only watched by people that are aware of it, but a lot of people who had no comprehension that this once occurred.
So 2 more comments, and then we don't want to keep you too long, but Drew says he's going to get his grandson to read the quotes.
Very good.
And then we have where the militiamen who secured the burnt district Civil War veterans.
Many of them were. As you might have seen earlier, I called them Sheridan's rifles, and they were actually under General Sheridan's Civil War troops. A lot of these people were to go into public protection, public service, not just firemen, policemen, but also in the federal government, and they were parts of the cavalry. So I think a lot of these people were. It's only 1872. I mean, it was something that ended in 1865, but we realized in some ways 7 years later, many of these men were still in active service with the government.
Well, thank you everyone for your wonderful questions, for joining us this evening. And thank you, Anthony, once again for a wonderful presentation.
Thank you, everyone. Good night. Bye-bye.
Take care. Good night.